This is the Real Coaching Podcast. I'm Joe Filial, coach of JFT Crew, the multinational triathlon squad. Thanks for the continued reception for the number of books I've put on joefilial.com/shop. I've had quite good feedback and receptions on the various books, Building the Elite Triathlete, where I talk about how I build a program taking on a new athlete, athlete development pathways, reviewing the history, and really setting up a program design with some examples of the templates we use, the microcycles, and how it might be different based on the level of the athlete. How Champions Train is summarizing my experiences working with some of the top athletes in the world, what a gold medal profile looks like, understanding demands of top-level Olympic pathway triathlon, and what the daily environment looks like of some of the top athletes in the world, training load management, and the role of the coach. And the third in the 3-book pack, The Characteristics of the High-Level Triathlete, is talking primarily about the attitude and behavior, motivational characteristics, commitment, the high-level things that really, I think, make the difference beyond just basic physiology. And finally, there's the characteristics of effective coaching, where I'm talking really about the things beyond understanding physiology and sports science that make the difference in coaching, that really make good coaches great coaches. What are those differences, and how can we develop those qualities? Finally, also for a limited time, I'm doing some one-to-one consulting. I've had various contacts over the years from coaches wanting to talk about coaching, or from athletes that would like a program review or some real talk about their level, where they're at, whether that be in Olympic triathlon or any discipline, really having an objective look. Well, I'm not able to do one-to-one coaching in general. Haven't been able to do that for a number of years, but at this period in the off season of 2020, now that the season is finally completed, if you're interested in that, we'll do a limited number of those where I think I can add value. And finally, for those that want to add some topics, some ideas for this season 3 of the Real Coaching Podcast, I've set up, based on some of the other podcasts that I listen to, speakpipe.com/Real Coaching Podcast, with the link in the show notes if you want to have a recorded question featured part of the show. We have one main topic this week, and that's triathlon swimming revisited. And previously in 2015, we had an episode of the Real Coaching Podcast with Paulo Souza, where we talked about swim myth busting. And we reviewed really why triathlon swimming is different than pool swimming, and how we integrate across swim, bike, run, and what are the differences. And that was based on an article that I had done in 2012 called the Top 20 Swim Tips for Faster Triathlon Swimming, the Top 20 Rules for Faster Triathlon Swimming, which seemed to really resonate. And I suppose that's because many triathletes don't come from a very strong swim background, but also to understand what makes triathlon swimming different. What are the impacts of the overall program? So topic today, we'll review all of these top 20 tips and really what's changed since, in my views, on triathlon swimming since swim myth busting in 2015 and this article from 2012, which was really based on how I built my view of swimming from the early 2000s to the present day. So we'll get started. Rule number 1, tip number 1, conditioning trumps drills. Technique matters, but the way that most athletes try to improve technique doesn't work. Get fitter and your ability to hold good technique improves. It takes a lot of work to develop aerobic conditioning in your upper body. If you're swimming a lot already but not improving, keep at it. There are no shortcuts. And I think this tip number one, in general, both the Swim Myth Busting podcast and this article most resonated in a positive way, but also gets people quite opinionated, particularly when it's about swim and technique and drills and that the whole view of what we should focus on as athletes. And a lot of people have different views, but the point this tip makes, which I think still resonates completely today with me, is that you need a certain level of conditioning in order to swim technically well. You need a certain level of fitness in order to hold good technique. And simply practicing technical drills just doesn't move the needle for a lot of athletes beyond the very basic. I mean, of course we can talk about, beginner swimming perhaps is different than certainly preparing to compete for really any athlete. So if we're talking beginner, we're talking about basic body position, how to breathe, breathing bilaterally, really simple, how to kick, basic stuff. But beyond that, you need a level of conditioning, and we know that because technique breaks down under fatigue, and there's simply athletes that overdo swim training. They're just not able to hold good technique, and why is that? Because they don't have the conditioning to hold the good technique. So the point this is it takes time, and that this ultimately in triathlon swimming, particularly in the conditions we race, open water, mass start, often wetsuit, really the most conditioned athletes are likely to have the best overall triathlon performance. And again, that's thinking about triathlon performance is the combination of swim, bike, run together. And that leads us to aerobic conditioning being the primary factor of success. Number 2, traditional drills don't work. The type of the drills and the way that most triathletes do them don't actually have any material impact on swimming technique. And that's the same today. Many athletes that come to swimming, that come to triathlon swimming, and come to endurance sport in general, don't have perhaps the greatest motor learning and proprioception abilities, and merely doing drills for the sake of them doesn't have any material impact on their technique and their biomechanics over time. Through not enough repetition, through the age of the athlete in terms of how many years along, and the longer you've been moving in a certain way, the more difficult it is to change that. And even individual, the way we're put together and the way we move. Obviously, we all have the same anatomy, but the way that we move is different, and I suppose if you were starting from a blank slate, well, you might be able to really make big technique changes, but that's rarely the case practically in swim coaching. We're not starting with a blank slate. We're starting with athletes that are farther along in years, and the way that we teach drills, it is just not effective, and we know that also because we don't measure their effectiveness in general, and the way that we teach skills. I mean, there's a whole area in skill teaching, whether it's more effective to break skills down into component parts and then put them back together, which is the way that most swimming drills are taught. Things like finger drag, fist, flick out the back of your stroke, all the sort of traditional things are breaking down the stroke. Single arm could be another one, versus another is whole skill where you emphasize one part, and that's where differentiating between traditional drills that many athletes are doing and different techniques such as drag tools that you could argue is a whole skill where it emphasizes a certain part of the stroke as a more effective way to learn. So again, highlighting that a lot of triathletes are not very good motor learners, and just doing a small amount of drills just doesn't make a big difference, and in fact may energy better spent in other areas. So that's the same. I still see that the same, and it's obviously most of these topics are rehashed in more or less the same way in 2015, but again, I think it's a useful exercise to revisit these, and of course not everyone listening would have listened to swim myth busting, but we'll put that in the show notes. Number 3, swim more often. Frequency is the best way to improve your swimming, and absolutely that remains today, and there's a variety of reasons why that's the case, but if we are talking about motor learning and comfort in the water, feel for the water, frequency is just a very powerful way to improve a little bit every day. It's better to swim more often per week than less often but more volume, and that's due to a variety of reasons. Most athletes don't have the conditioning to swim well for higher volumes, fewer frequency. So with lower conditioning, if we have shorter swim sessions, but more often, that's more effective. And of course, going to the pool at the current moment, not easy everywhere, but even in a normal situation, of course, it means driving to the pool. It takes more time. In terms of commuting and in time of the day, and for, of course, many age group athletes, the swim actually takes, it's not the most important part of the race, but at the same time, if we're talking about improving swimming, then swim frequency is going to be a very powerful part of that. And certainly when I'm building programs, I'll start with frequency first, then build volume on top, then build intensity. So it's the starting point that I'll take building swim programs. And indeed, when we're talking about advanced techniques, then we're talking about even higher frequency of double swims on some days for exactly the same reason, this motor learning effect and feel for the water the more you're in it. Number 4, do longer main sets. You can't expect to swim fast and be fresh on the bike if you rarely do main sets with the same or higher volume and pace than you expect to complete in the race. So for a short course, these should be at least 2K main sets. For Ironman, 4K main sets or more. And that looks like 20 to 50 by 100, not many short broken sets adding up to 2 to 5K as an example. And again, that remains the case. I think there's a case to be made for efficient swim training for triathlon, in that we remove a lot of the fluff that a lot of club programs and age group programs would do, which fluff meaning, a variety of drills that don't particularly work, kicking, other things that there's just not leading to where improvements can be made in conditioning. And, when I see, for example, very long warm-ups and a lot of variety in the set, and it's just not the way that we're going to be as conditioned as we need to be. And of course, you can't expect to get onto the bike fresh if you're heavily fatigued from the effort of the swim. And we need to be conditioned. See rule number 1. So I think, again, an efficient set design has the focus on a main set, and the main set being a consistent block of work over the volume of race distance. And that's perhaps not every single day you're swimming, but we need some sets like that where we're building our conditioning in a meaningful way to be as fresh as we can be on the bike and to sustain the pace that we need to on the swim. So less fluff, more longer main sets. Rule number 5, don't overthink it, but don't underthink it. Be engaged with what you're doing in the water. Use tools to help get a better feel for the water, but don't overthink every stroke and suffer from paralysis by analysis. Swimming fast is about rhythm and flow when good technique becomes automatic. And again, absolutely, this continues to resonate. You have to be engaged with what you're doing, but it's very easy, to have too many things to think about. And certainly when athletes receive some coaching or perhaps a video analysis, it's easy to chuck a whole bunch of points at the athlete, and it's impossible to think about all these things. And so it's useful to have one or two cues specific to an athlete that we can revisit from a coaching point of view, but also as an athlete, being engaged with what you are doing in the water as an athlete. But I think equally for coaches, we can't overload technical cues. So for a lot of athletes, that can be simple things, can be head position for somebody that tends to look or breathe too high. For another, it might just be the front end of the stroke and engaging early catch. Another, it might be finishing well or identifying a difference between right and left. Of course, we don't expect athletes to swim completely symmetrically, but there can be a few things that we can pick up and really simplify in terms of technical engagement. And of course, engagement also means with the set and the work that you're doing. Certainly see when athletes are not doing this, they can be switched off. They can just be going up and down the pool and not really thinking about what they're doing, not really aware of what the purpose of the set is or the best way to manage the set. So we need the right amount of engagement, and just showing up, just turning up and doing the work, quote unquote, is not really enough. We need a little more engagement than that. It's not enough just to turn up, but we have to think about what we're doing and how we're doing it, and simplify any sort of technical input or focus. And when I can see and I can visualize an athlete who are suffering from this paralysis by analysis, they often really swim robotically because they're thinking about everything they're doing. And of course, we know when we do that, when we're consciously thinking about how we're moving in repetitive movements, our efficiency goes down, and in fact, it's very difficult to effectively train with thinking too much about what we're doing. So we just need the right amount, and really, of course, swimming rhythmically with flow, so that the essentials become automatic is our goal. Number 6, increase swim fitness translate to the bike and run. Being able to swim harder, starting the bike both fresher and with faster riders is how that works. And absolutely, this is a theme of the ones we've talked about so far. The fitter and more conditioned you are on the swim. In fact, the harder you can swim, the more you're able to get out of yourself during the swim, and that's because the open water swim racing is fundamentally different than pool swimming. It's harder, it's more physical. Of course, we're not in our own lane. We're in the same physical space of other athletes. It's challenging, and the dynamics of open water swimming means that you have to start harder than you would in a pool time trial, and then you have to hold on to your pace, your effort, and your techniques. So it really emphasizes the benefit of being very well aerobically conditioned, so that you can get more out of yourself and of course arrive to the bike in both better position and having hopefully spent less time at the limit during the swim, so that you can get on the bike and be in the best position during critical moments. Of course, in Olympic path racing, the first 5 minutes of the bike is is absolutely critical for positioning. But even in long distance racing at top level, the first part of the bike is equally important, and really just finding your position, finding your legs. The more conditioned you are, the better you're going to manage the bike as well as eventually the run. So again, swim conditioning, swim fitness impacts your whole race. And often think about, as coaches and athletes, we want to break down triathlon into swim, bike, run, but really I think that the finish line is where we measure the effectiveness of the individual discipline programs. The athlete who wins the race is by definition the best triathlete, but also it demonstrates that they're having an effective swim program or effective bike or run, because they're able to get to the finish line first. So again, deep conditioning makes a big difference. Number 7, corollary to number 6, deep swim fitness allows you to swim on the rivet. Most triathletes don't really know how to swim hard for the duration. And this just really connects to the rule 6, is that, it's a skill to learn how to swim at your limit for the whole duration, to swim hard, to be able to pace the swim in the unique triathlon way of starting very, very hard and settling into your pace, settling into your rhythm. And the better your conditioning is, the better you're able to do that. And so that's a skill that can be developed. It's not even simply a matter of just doing hard swim training, but learning how to find that rhythm, learning how to stay on the rivet. And of course, on the rivet is a reference to cycling and particularly in time trialing, but any hard effort where you just find the right balance of effort that is sustainable and at your limit, but not over. With the rivet being the old school bike saddles that were riveted together, the old leather saddles. Number 8, include some quality in every swim. If you're swimming less than 5 times a week, having easy swims is a waste of time. Always include quality from band to paddles in every swim. And here, perhaps it doesn't resonate quite as much in my current practice, but if we expand quality to mean not only intensity, but some particular focus, of course, it could be drag tools like band. Certainly, I would use paddles in almost every swim. Sprints, very short amount, could be used in every swim. But quality has to be that wider definition. I think we can't expect to swim some hard effort in every swim. And certainly how my coaching practices evolved over time is certainly thinking about that easy endurance swimming, and the volume of easy endurance swimming is also a quality to develop, and it's equally important, not just the faster, harder swims. So I think in these cases, of course, we can have an easy swim, but we shouldn't have swims where we don't have a particular focus, just recovery. We shouldn't have too many of those, but certainly see some programs that have, their 1, 2, or 3 hard swims per week, and that's really it for the focus, as opposed to the endurance swims or strength-based swims where we can have a type of quality of focus, and that gives us maximizing the time we're spending training. And the point here in this number 8 is if you're swimming less than 5 times a week in particular. So of course the programs and the direct coaching I'm doing is 5 times or more, but if you're swimming 3 times a week, certainly having one swim as an easy swim doesn't really make sense in this perspective, and we ought to use that to develop a particular area rather than just have it recovery, simply because the frequency is low enough that we need to make those swims count. Rule number 9, don't count strokes. See rule number 2, the objective is to get faster and not to take fewer strokes. And seeing rule number 2 was traditional swim drills don't work. And certainly we in my practice for many years we've not count strokes. Of course, it's a rudimentary way of measuring efficiency, but of course you can swim very slow also with very few strokes, so it's not a total solution. And I certainly wouldn't recommend it for most moderate or advanced swimmers. It's not the point to take fewer strokes, and in fact for open water swimming, it's really, we need to practice the other way, which is one of the following points. But learning to swim with too much distance per stroke is out of balance, and you can consider the pace or the speed you're going as a connection of distance per stroke and stroke rate. It's going to give us our speed, but I think there's a particular school in swim coaching which is really focused on the fewer strokes and distance, and too much emphasis on distance per stroke, which is just the opposite of what we need in most open water situations. And so we also need to train the higher stroke rates. So distance per stroke and counting strokes is focused on the wrong thing for most athletes. Rule 10, learn how to use your kick, but don't spend a lot of time with kick sets. Kicking is about stroke control and body position, not for propulsion for triathlon. Kick fitness doesn't matter. And again, for most athletes, this is the case. I don't incorporate really any kick training in my swimming, and really particularly for age groups which may be swimming open water or long distances, you certainly wouldn't expect a high kick frequency and kick fitness. The kick fitness that you need for most athletes can be built in part of regular training, regular full stroke training. It's not necessary to isolate, and for time limited athletes and volume limited athletes, it's just not where we're going to get the most bang for our bucks. So wouldn't waste time doing a bunch of kick sets if you're swimming fewer than 5 times a week. And again, certainly with my athletes, I wouldn't spend a lot of time on kick fitness, as it were. Kicking helps your timing and body position, helps breathing timing, so it serves a purpose, but over kicking is not particularly useful, and we can build that through our regular swim training. So again, the point here is with these top 20 tips is just not to spend a whole bunch of time on this. Use it in other areas to make a bigger difference. Number 11, use a band frequently. This is the best swimming drill there is. Do short reps with a lot of rest at first. Both propulsion and body position will improve. And so a band here is a ankle band, so we're tying our ankles together, tying our feet together so we can't kick. And of course, connected to 10 about the kick doesn't matter. Of course, you find that it makes a big difference on body position, even just a little bit of light kicking. But what band does is it forces you to generate propulsion, or you don't go anywhere. And certainly it helps emphasize an early catch and holding water as a constraint-based drill. And I've fluctuated the amount of band use over the years. I think there's a certain level of conditioning that's needed to do a reasonable amount of band, and certainly, as the tip says, do short reps with a lot of rest. So in a 25-meter pool with a lot of rest can be effective if it's a new drill to an athlete, and doing 200 to 400 can be enough at the start, broken up into 25s. Some athletes can do more, but it's something that, in order to benefit from, you have to bring a certain energy to it. So if you're already fatigued, then perhaps you won't get as much out of it. But in general, these kind of drag drills that emphasize propulsion and emphasize an early catch and feeling the water soon after entry can be really useful as a whole stroke drill to emphasize really what the most important technical skill is, which is holding water, which is keeping the elbow up, armpit open, and using your lats. So learning how to propel yourself is why we would use band. And you could go through a particular phase, say where you do 2 or 3 sessions like this per week over, say, 4 to 6 weeks, and then perhaps vary slightly less. But in general, it's a useful drill for many athletes, and can really help learning of the essential skill. Number 12, use paddles with awareness of engaging lats. Connected to number 11, effective swimming is being able to use your large core muscles, your lats, in order to be able to really propel yourself. So this tip really frames using paddles as about learning how to engage your lats, and that's because they give you a bit of feedback on your hand. A little bit of that pressure on your hand helps keep your elbow up and armpit open during the early catch, and that's how you use your lats. If the classic swimming technical error of dropped elbow is really when your elbow is far behind your hand, or in the early part of the stroke. So you enter the water, hand goes down, but elbow is back and armpit is more closed. That's the classic error that stops you from using those prime movers for your swimming. So again, using paddles can be thought of in a lot of different ways. It's certainly a way to vary the effort that you're doing, but thinking of paddles as a technical tool is an effective way. And here we can also think about the different types of paddles. There are a lot of different types, but often I see athletes using paddles that are too big, that slow the stroke rate down too much, and they're not really able to apply force in an effective way, and that don't just give a bit of feedback on the hand to keep the elbow up. So paddles that are too big is a mistake for many athletes. One of the first things we do with a lot of athletes is take off the wristband of the paddles so that they are only held on the finger, and then you must use water pressure to hold the paddle on. So this also gives you some feedback about whether you're swimming technically effectively with paddles, because if you only have the finger strap on and you're sculling side too much, then you'll get some feedback on the paddle. It might feel like it wants to slip off or not be centered on your hand. So again, using paddles of the right size and paddles that don't have a wristband is a way to technically improve your swimming. And then the other types of paddles, like the finis paddle that attaches, or you hold with your thumb and doesn't have any straps. That's also interesting to use, and essentially has the same tool, the same technical point, which is you must use water pressure to hold the paddle on, and then you squeeze the thumb at the exit of the stroke before re-entry, so the paddle stays on your hand, and then you relax your hand as you're pushing back. So those are the finis agility paddles. Can be a good way to vary the technical tools you're using. And often our athletes will have a variety of different paddles. So the ones that are working on improving their swimming might have 2 or 3 sets of different paddles for different uses, and to give different kind of feedback. And certainly there's some that pass the wrist and keep a fixed wrist. That can also have a use, or that come up the forearm even. So there's many different types of paddles that can be used. In general, I don't use the ones that pass the wrist and forearm as much, but agility paddles, different sizes of flexible flat paddles. I don't like the paddles as much that have shape for the hands. I think flat flexible paddle gives good feedback as a technical tool. Number 13 is keeping your head low on breathing and open water. And generally the cue, head down, feet up, and it's the most common body position error. And I see a lot of athletes with head position too high, in particular open water, and causes their hips and feet to sink a little bit. And so a good cue is keeping your head down, looking forward, a little bit underwater, but not all the way forward, as some do, and also head down on the breath. So a lot of athletes lift their head quite a lot when they're breathing, and that causes their feet and hips to sink, causing more drag. So as a technical cue for some athletes, it's quite good. And of course, with a wetsuit, this is easier to hold a good body position because your feet and hips don't sink as much if you're not even if you are lifting your head, they don't sink as much, but at the same time that covers up the technical error, and it's something a lot of athletes need to do. Keep that head down, push the chest down, and keep a good body position. So that remains the same. Number 14, do many short repetitions for stroke quality. It takes fitness to swim with good technique for longer durations. Start shorter and swim faster, 50 by 50, for example. If you don't have time to do a 2,500 meter main set, drop the warm up and warm down. So this connects to a number of things, the length of the main set, but really how you make the main set. And I think it's knowing yourself as a swimmer, or knowing the athletes you're coaching, and that how much conditioning do they have? How much of a main set or volume of a session can they swim with quality, meaning with good technique, before they obviously get fatigued and start swimming with, for example, dropped elbows. They're not pulling themselves as much. Maybe they're taking a higher stroke rate and losing efficiency. So I think we need to be present where the current fitness level is, where the current conditioning is, and in the same way that I talk about running, let's have a reality check of what the athlete can do with quality. And one way to swim with a greater percentage of your training with higher quality is to do higher reps of shorter distances with more rest. And in that way, we can still accumulate a good volume of work, and a greater percentage of that can be of higher quality just with more rest. And of course, eventually we can progress to longer reps, but for many athletes, starting with 400s, 500s or more, over the course of a set, they just won't swim with a great quality. They'll start swimming technically poor just as they fatigue, because there's just not enough rest. As simple as that. The work to rest ratio isn't right, and so particularly with athletes that are trying to improve their swim, we'll break things down into do a higher number of reps, and therefore have more rest, and a greater percentage of the time with better quality, as measured and as seen as, are the athletes able to hold the technique that they want, hold the mechanics they want, or do they exceed their conditioning? I think it's one of the problems with really high volume swim training or aggressive swim training with too much intensity or too much work, too much volume, is what you end up seeing is athletes that they're swimming poorly for a greater percentage of that, and it's not that it's totally wasted, but there are perhaps more effective ways of going about that. And that's one of the things about triathlon is you come in fatigued from biking and running, and what you do in the bike and run impacts what quality you'll be able to swim. And some days you won't be able to do what you want to do technically because you're fatigued from bike and run training, and therefore you've got to modify what you're doing if you want to maintain a percentage of your training with higher quality. And so breaking down into short reps is an effective way to do that. Number 15, learning to swim with a higher stroke rate. It takes conditioning, and it will pay off on race day, particularly anytime swimming open water in a group and in rough conditions. And again, this is contrasting to the counting strokes, distance per stroke side of the equation. But effective swimming open water in the conditions that we see there, which is often it's not flat water. There can be chop, can be wind causing the chop, there can be current, there can be all kinds of different conditions, and indeed surrounded by other athletes in your space. You can't just swim with a nice long pool stroke, a long distance per stroke, because your arms will get hit. You won't be able to get that kind of distance per stroke in those conditions, and you have to swim with a shorter, higher stroke rate in order to move yourself forward, in order to recover from when your arms get hit, from people being in your space, from going around buoys. Certainly, in the top of the sport, the first 10 or so swimmers don't have as much contact. They can swim more like pool swimmers, but for the majority of athletes in Olympic pathway, but also in long distance racing and age groupers, you're surrounded by people. They're all over in your space, and you have to be able to learn how to swim with a high stroke rate, and you have to practice that. It takes greater conditioning, and it's why a lot of athletes come out of the water knackered after their open water races relative to their training, because they're swimming with a different mechanic than they practice in the pool. So we've got to practice that. We've got to bring that to some of our sets, higher stroke rate swimming to our main sets, and in order to build conditioning for those kind of rough conditions that we see in our actual racing. So again, it's contrasting pool swimming to open water, and the skills you need open water, and it's how tightly connected conditioning is for open water swimming performance. Number 16, if you need to write your swim session down on the whiteboard or paper, it's too complicated. Keep it simple. And this one, even many years after writing this, I still try to do the same thing. Of course, some variety is good, but this also requires engagement of the athlete. They have to listen if you're on deck coaching, and they have to think about what you're saying and what the goal is. So it requires a kind of engagement, but also it forces us as coaches to simplify what we're doing. And remove sort of the fluff. Again, we're training for endurance. We're training for conditioning. We're training for the conditions of open water. We don't need complicated sets. It should be simple to explain, and it's a personal challenge. If I need to write it down, then not that there's anything wrong per se with writing it down, but it challenges you to keep it simple. And again, I think I see a lot of what we call inefficient swim programs that have got many, many different sets. And while it can be interesting to a point, you can also ask, is it effective? And endurance training is repetitive. It requires consistency and doing the work. And I think a simple approach is always going to be effective, and it doesn't mean a not considered approach. Of course, we're considering what we're doing, and we're considering what the point of what we're doing is, but we need to keep it simple, and so the athlete can clearly understand what we're trying to achieve, and then go out and be engaged in doing it. Number 17 is oriented around age group swimmers, and that's finding a good master's program. And the thought here is, how do you evaluate what a good master's program is? And the point goes, long main sets are a good sign. Swimming with others to challenge yourself. Good programs like this are probably the exception rather than the norm. I think a lot of age group or club programs are oriented around being fun or interesting and managing the number of swimmers in the pool. It's harder to do some of the things we're doing if you've got 15 people in a short course lane, for example, or just too many people in general. You often end up having to do short intervals, which is not necessarily a problem, but doing long sets with too many people, we often don't see that. So a good master's program oriented around endurance swimming can help. And again, the point there with this tip is also providing some structure, meeting people. You're probably going to get more out of yourself with that structure rather than going in and doing your own set on some days. So if you're able to find a good master's program and that gives you motivation and structure to the week's training, then I think that's a benefit, and trying to find ones that have the right design according to the needs of triathletes and long distance swimmers is what we're looking for. Number 18, don't use swim tools as a crutch. Paddles and pull buoys are tools with specific uses, and don't reach for them out of simple laziness because the set is hard. And certainly seen some of this in the past. We're doing a swim set and athlete's tired, and we put the pull buoys and paddles in order to continue to make the pace or make the pace times, or and there's nothing per se wrong with using paddles and these tools in order for specific use, which is to maintain form during a long set, because we've run out of conditioning for swimming. For free swimming, if the technique is starting to go, if the times are starting to go, we might put the paddle and pull buoy on for better body position and for a greater duration of the set than we might otherwise be able to do with good technique. But not just to swim faster or harder. At that point, we know that we reach the limit in swimming, of good technical swimming. And the point of these tools is to do a little bit more volume with good swimming. It's not just to swim harder. I've seen that be an issue in the past, where it becomes just a crutch in order to swim hard, and athletes in this that are following this path tend not to be able to only swim without the tools at a good effort and over the right distance. So there's a balance there. Of course, we do a lot of pulling, a lot of paddle work, but can't be something you always do, or in order to see faster times on the clock, because some athletes that are very good pullers might be able to pull much faster than they swim, and then they start to always want to reach for the paddles and pull buoy just so they can see the faster times, and not to see them as a technical tool that helps the big picture. Number 19, connected to number 18, is do use the swim tools when you are very fatigued and will otherwise swim with poor quality. And again, these two are very closely linked. If an athlete is fatigued, and I can see they're not able to swim, only swim the volume that we think we want to do, then we can use these tools in order to maintain a volume with better quality. And again, connecting when you put paddles on and you think of them as a technical tool, the bit of pressure on the hand tends to keep the elbow up and an armpit open and engage the lats a bit better. So and we as triathletes, we face a a lot of time where we get in the water and we're fatigued. The legs are fatigued from biking and running. The body position is lower than might otherwise be. And in order to continue to maximize the work that we can do, the effectiveness of the work that we can do, using tools like this, particularly helping the body position, helps us accumulate more work and be better conditioned, as opposed to shortening the set and or getting out of the water if we're really fatigued. And sometimes that's the solution that we need. But of course, the art of coaching is figuring out which those moments are that we need to stop, and where we can make the modifications, those small decisions. Number 20, dry land and gym can help swimming for some by improved neuromuscular recruitment. For those doing that, using body weight and tubings more than machines is likely to be more effective. And this one is the age-old discussion and conflict in swim training, is the effectiveness of dry land, the effectiveness of gym training, and dry land, of course, referring to exercise out of the water, and the impact it can have on swimming. And for many triathletes, they might be doing some gym work already. They can incorporate some swimming specific movements, and there's something to be said about the neuromuscular recruitment that you can gain by doing swim specific actions with tubing or body weight or machines with cables. There can be some benefit there. There's not a substitute for swimming. And I wouldn't suggest overdoing those areas. I think in the current situation, more athletes would have not been able to swim with the frequency they want, and so it certainly can help. And using tubing and bands can be certainly better than not being able to swim. But I don't, there's a limit to how much work out of the water can help your work in the water, and I think it's seeing the right perspective of what can be gained by this type of work, and it's in the same vein as how much gym work can improve endurance and long distance racing, and certainly in the short term we can see some improvements, but it's always the bigger picture. How do we sustain improvements, and where are the areas that we can really make a difference in endurance sport? And it always comes back to frequency, volume primarily, and certainly intensity, and then specific individual needs and how people are put together. And some athletes have a tendency to develop pain around the shoulders, and in this case, specific gym work could help avoid recurrence of those patterns, but those are specific to knowing about the individual and knowing their background and where they have their experiences from the past. So that's in a more specific, individualized way than a general way. So I think it's just putting dryland in perspective, and how we could use that to substitute in the current situation, but also addition to swimming. And certainly if somebody was looking to improve their swimming that didn't have a great background, I think having dry land band warm up as part before they get in the water can be useful, as long as it doesn't take time out of swimming. But an extra 10 or 15 minutes of dry land before getting in the water via tubing and activation can be useful and beneficial. Number 21, this was an additional one that was added after the article, and that's repetition is your friend. Variety is for the weak-minded and interferes with the learning process. Repetition. And that's just emphasizing the nature of endurance swimming, much like endurance sport and swim, bike, run altogether. There's a certain amount of repetition that's just part of endurance sport, and I think when we reach too much for variety, we're not paying attention to the value of repetition in that repeating the same process allows us to learn by keeping the constraints the same and seeing change over time, being aware of change over time. But also with doing the work, variety sometimes it can be a substitute for doing the right amount of work and doing the work consistently enough, and is often not necessary. I think one of the best ways to measure your improvements in swimming is to do the same group of sets over time and seeing the difference in, from recovery to the quality that's able to be done, to the effort it takes, to the perceived exertion. And those kind of repetition, that kind of repetition can take the place of even time trials or other ways that tests that you would measure your improvement, but simply repeating the same type of key sessions, and you'll see over time improvement. And so embracing repetition and embracing the focus on of consistent work over time is a key part of improving your swimming. So certainly that has remained. Of course, there's a right amount of variety, but I think it's overdone in most cases. And the bonus with this article was really, if you want to swimming, you have to love swimming. You have to embrace the process of getting faster in the water. Chlorine sweat is a good thing. And I think that you put this in there because a lot of triathletes, I think that if you've not come from a swimming background, it's hard at first to get fit enough to really enjoy the process. But once you get over that hump, that initial fitness, then you can really get stuck into the process, enjoy it a lot more. So like a lot of things, you need to have the longer term view in order to really benefit, and the patience and self-discipline in order to do the work for long enough in order that you can see the improvements, and that you can improve the swim as part of your overall triathlon performance. And one of the points that has often come up that caused controversy in the past with triathlon swimming is how important is it for age group athletes? And I think that the point is part of the overall aerobic load. Swimming is a way to increase your aerobic training volume with relatively little chance of injury, and there's limits to how much cycling and running you can do, and it's an important part of being fresh enough on the bike and ultimately on the run. So I think, there's a proportion that is the right proportion depending on background and where you are to maximize your performance in triathlon. You have to be in good swimming condition and good overall condition. So swimming plays an important part of that, and it's a way that we can have the best overall triathlon performance. So those are the swimming tips, the Triathlon Swimming Revisited. Put a link to Swim Myth Busting, where we go into detail with Paulo Souza on these. But most of these points, I think, hold up as originally written. Of course, when I look at the swim sets I prescribe over time, a lot of them are very similar. Why change? The style, of course, I've evolved and write new swim sets all the time, but a lot of those basics that I've been using for many years remain the same, and these points and views haven't changed too much, and I think all remain relevant today. And really, you could apply the concepts to biking and running in a similar way, and in fact that's some of how I arrived at these is applying endurance training principles in general to swim performance in triathlon swimming. So that's the top 20 swim tips revisited and still relevant almost 10 years later to me in my coaching practice, and I'm sure to many of you. Feedback, questions, direct is best to email podcast@joefilial.com. not checking the socials as much these days, so this is the best way to get in contact. And if you want to leave a voice question for future podcasts or to keep season 3 going, then your input will help me come up with the right topics and the right ideas that can be interesting and value to you, either as coaches or athletes looking to improve their performance. And that's speakpipe.com/realcoachingpodcast. Thanks for listening.